What's up, guys? How you doing?
Good.
Pretty good.
Great. Cool. Good to see you. I think last time I saw you was 2 years ago. We're having some lunch, and we were talking about consulting companies. And so I think a lot's changed since then. By the way, we're all hanging out at my house for the audience. These guys slept up the street in the heat.
All 2 blocks of it.
All 2 blocks, yeah. So
it's a highly local podcast today.
Highly local, locally grown. So yeah, I guess for the audience who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro, maybe starting with you, Aaron?
Sure. Aaron Neiderhiser. I'm the co-founder of Tuva Health, along with Coco, who's sitting across from me. Been in healthcare data my entire career, basically. That's the short story on me.
Okay.
Yeah, Coco Zuloaga. Also been in healthcare data for most of my career. Aaron and I met like 2015 or so. We became close friends. We had a chance to work together at Health Catalyst in the past. We both spent a lot of time thinking and working with healthcare data, thinking about it, and started a company together.
I must like it a lot. So I guess healthcare data is one of these things I'm like remarkably ignorant about. So, but you guys seem very obsessed with it. Why are you obsessed with healthcare data?
I think it's just like this problem that, isn't solved. Like, I never wanted to work in healthcare.
Okay.
Like I randomly got into healthcare after grad school. And then once you get in, it's pretty interesting. Like trying to understand which treatments work best for different diseases, trying to understand how like the delivery of healthcare and how we can improve it and make it more efficient. Everybody's life is touched by healthcare in some way. Mm-hmm. And so then you start to see that represented in the data, and you get a bunch of ideas for interesting questions you want to try and answer with the data. But as it turns out, healthcare data is enormously complex. Like it's just really challenging to work with. And so I think that interest is what personally for me has kept me coming back to try and make the data easier to work with.
Interesting. What about you, Coco?
I mean, well, for me, I guess I came into healthcare from a data science angle. So I was, in a previous life, I was a physicist. I was really interested in math and machine learning. And I came in with this like kind of romantic idea of how cool it would be to tackle all these very practical problems in healthcare with sexy techniques in machine learning and AI.
Yeah.
But very quickly realized it was very difficult to do that because of how difficult it is to work with healthcare data. More so than in other industries, I think, because of the complexity of healthcare data. And so I started becoming just fascinated with how can we make this data useful and what does it take to make this data useful. And so I gradually started kind of working upstream from the actual machine learning applications and how do you clean and prepare data for machine learning training sets and what kind of domain knowledge is needed for that. And so I started just going deeper and deeper into the healthcare domain expertise and realized there's a world of complexity there that's super interesting.
What's complicated?
Well, it's like with any, anybody who works with data, like is super familiar with the like data wrangling problem, right? We spend 95% of our time like cleaning and transforming data, and it doesn't matter what data set you're working with. Mm-hmm. In healthcare, that's like 10 to 100x.
Okay.
And the reason that's the case is because, everybody's probably familiar with like medical records,
right?
And like your physician's like entering, your data into the medical records system when you see your doctor.
Sorry, that's my dog. So
she's excited to see me.
Yeah, she is. Yep.
But those source systems, like the medical record system or the claims processing system, those systems were not designed to structure data in such a way that it's ready for analysis or machine learning. And so there's like, if you wanted to answer a question, like whenever I talk to my parents about what I do, they're like, oh yeah, like all my data's in the medical record. Like I'm sure people are mining that data to figure out like what treatments work best for me. And I'm like, no one's doing that.
Really?
No data is being used for that. And it's because the data, this kind of like, mountain of data processing that has to be done to first transform the data into tables that can be used to answer those sorts of questions.
Wait, so this data's not tabular then?
It's tabular. Well, in some cases it's tabular.
Okay.
Right? So, like a lot of the claims data sets are tabular. A lot of the medical records data sets are tabular. Let's take a practical example though. So like there's a medical record system called Elation. All right.
Okay.
It's a common medical record system that providers use. There's no data in the back end database of Elation that you can use to say how many office visits happened last week.
Really?
Yeah, the data is spread out and structured across a bunch of different tables that are designed to make data entry easy. So they have things like appointments or visit notes or bills. But to get to the true count of visits that actually occurred, you have to pull together a combination of those things.
And so yeah, that makes it so that answering even the simplest questions from raw data is impossible. You have to do a lot of pre-processing of the raw data. But the tricky thing is that in healthcare, as opposed to other industries where I've done a little bit of work, the complexity of the pre-processing is monumental because of the amount of domain expertise that is needed. You need to know a lot about how claims data works, a lot about how medical records, just to be able to do the pre-processing on the raw data. And so you have to pre-process it just to create very, very basic concepts with which you can start to answer questions. Like Aaron said, if you want to know how many office visits happened last year, you have to build the concept of an office visit from raw data elements. If you want to, and there's concepts that are very basic, like the concept of an acute inpatient stay in a hospital, and defining that from raw claims data requires a tremendous amount of logic. It's just massive transformations and
That's
a lot
bananas.
It's crazy, yeah.
So if I had to do anything, if I had one wish, right?
Yeah.
I would wish that the God of our universe would come down and say, you know what, medical records vendors and claims processing vendors, we're going to have one data model, and it's going to be the back-end data model across all of our source systems, and we're going to standardize to that so that the data is structured the right way. That would get us 50. That would get us like 50% of the way there, maybe.
Have there been any initiatives to do this?
The biggest one is probably FHIR, FHIR, Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. So there's this big standards organization in healthcare called Health Level 7, and they've made various standards over the years. FHIR is the most recent one, and it's basically a REST API JSON standard for modeling healthcare data. And it's been pretty widely adopted. Like a lot of the health systems and providers and health plans are mapping their data to FHIR. But FHIR has a couple of challenges. One, it's not relational, so it's JSON. Two, that mapping that happens, everyone's doing that in a different way. So there's not a lot of standardization around how you might just have one person who's kind of doing it part-time, kind of figuring it out. And then that data, there's like just a big kind of like data quality trust problem with a lot of the data in healthcare, and that's like part of that.
But even FHIR is very raw. So even if you have clean FHIR data, it's hard to answer questions with a lot of it without defining some concepts on top of FHIR.
Yeah.
And actually, this idea of defining concepts on the raw data was kind of what started us down the path of eventually creating this company. It's basically, we were fascinated by the idea of how defining concepts on data that are used for analytics can have a tremendous impact on the actual analytics and the questions that the answers that you're getting to certain questions. We read a paper about a couple years ago, a year and a half ago or something. The paper was titled "Same Data, Different Conclusions." It came out of Berlin, and we were both blown away by what they were talking about. It's basically, it was a study where they gave the exact same data set to a bunch of teams, and they asked to post the same question with the same data to different teams, and different teams reached radically different conclusions from the same data, and they all had statistically sound methods, but they reached different conclusions. So the question is like, how can they have basically opposing conclusions with the same data set? And the answer was that they defined different high-level concepts on the raw data with which they answered the questions.
Was this related to medical data, or was it just a different data set?
That was just a general data set.
Interesting.
But we were fascinated by the idea of how defining concepts in different ways can lead to different conclusions. And in healthcare, that's obviously...
You have to define concepts in healthcare data because medicine and biology in general is like huge multifactorial problem, right? Like how many different body systems, diseases, it's incredibly complex. And the coding systems that are used, like ICD-10 is a common coding system. There's over 100,000 different codes for diagnosing conditions and procedures.
Whoa.
So you need to build these like higher level concepts that's like, what is a type 2 diabetes patient? What is like, are the different classes of drugs that you can use to treat type 2 diabetes? And these, like Coco said, the different ways these concepts are created can dramatically impact the results.
That's really fascinating.
And so what's really interesting in healthcare is that a lot of these concepts are pretty complex, For some of them, there is a standard. For example, CMS defines the CMS readmission measures. They're it's very complicated logic of how to define readmission measures to do analytics around hospital readmissions. The logic for these concepts is defined in hundreds of pages of PDFs that CMS publishes every year. And it's a standard. So what's happening today is that different organizations are reading those PDFs, translating that logic into code on their own, and then calculating these measures. Everybody's doing it on their own. So the same logic could be translated into code in slightly different ways by different teams and getting different results, even though it's a standard, because the standard doesn't exist in code. It just exists in a written PDF. And that's for a case where there is a standard. There's many other concepts for which there is no standard. For example, in healthcare, if you want to report spend and utilization analytics, you don't just report raw spend. You have to normalize spend. And the way people typically normalize spend in healthcare is per member per month. And the concept of these member months, as they're called in healthcare, can be defined in different ways. And there's at least two ways in which people normally do them, which lead to different outcomes of the calculation with the same data set. So there's a lot of room for, even when there's a standard, implementing it in different ways by just pure error, or when there's not a standard, people defining the concept in different ways and getting different outcomes for something, even with the same data set.
You know what I'm just realizing? Because like we spend all day just like talking about this with like each other.
Yeah.
And now we're talking about it with Joe, who is not in this all day, and I'm just realizing how insane all this.
Well, it is, and I'm also writing a book on data modeling right now, and this seems like the nightmare scenario. And so, you're talking about concept drift, right?
Yeah.
That paper, I'm gonna have to go check that paper out, but it's fascinating because I'm actively working on a new book about this topic, but it's like healthcare just seems like the most insane extreme of this. I
haven't come across the worst one.
That's one reason I probably stayed out of it for a long time. I'm just like, don't really want to know, don't really want to deal with this. It just seems crazy. So sorry for the audience if you hear clacking. That's my dog walking on the hardwood floors here.
She's a sweetheart.
She is, aren't you? But anyway, yeah, that sounds like crazy town. I'm just sitting here trying to wrap my head around this because it's everyone I talk to who works with healthcare data says it's pretty gnarly. But you guys are trying to figure out like an open source solution to this. Like, what's up with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of parts of this kind of data transformation process that we just feel should be completely open for everyone to use.
Yeah.
So like all these measure definitions for things like readmissions, preventable ED visits, quality measures, those definitions should just be free and publicly available.
Why aren't they?
I mean, some of them, like Coco said, are. Like there is the readmission measures are published, but they're published as PDFs. So
Not as code. It's just published as English logic written in paragraphs that people read and translate to code.
And if you look at like the history of all the healthcare data analytics companies, I think open source is like a hard business model, and it's a little bit even harder in healthcare. Customers don't understand it.
Yeah.
And so
who is the customer in this case?
Customers are anybody that has medical records data or claims data
Okay.
that's trying to do analysis. So that could be a health system, a provider, a health plan, a pharma company that's trying to do clinical trials and make drugs. So it varies a lot in terms of users of the data.
Interesting. How have we gotten by this long with the system so screwed up like this?
Well, for the longest time, healthcare data wasn't even digitized. Healthcare is a very bureaucratic, kind of old school industry and tends to follow a good decade behind other industries, if not more. So for the longest, it wasn't until Obama, as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2008, I think 2008, 2009, passed high tech. And that was all the money for medical records. And that took medical records adoption in the U.S. from like 10% to 95%. And so that resulted in a lot of the data finally being digitized. But then you kind of had the first wave of healthcare data companies come along. And at that point, it wasn't even like this data transformation problem is kind of a second order problem. Initially, it was just data access. Like you would have people at health systems being like, I know we have this medical record system. I know there's data in it, but I can't get access to it.
Really?
So Health Catalyst and other companies like that would come along and say, you know what? Let's bring all this data into a data warehouse. Let's make it really easy for you to access the data. Mm-hmm. And that was like a huge win. And so in a lot of ways, this like solving this data transformation problem is just kind of like a second order, like next step sort of thing.
Has access been solved then?
I wouldn't say it's been solved, but it's gotten a lot better, especially with the so there's this law passed in 2016 called the 21st Century Cures Act that basically led to a lot of the opening up of healthcare data. Prior to that, it was kind of difficult to get your medical records. And now you can get any of your healthcare data for any reason pretty much via request. It's a lot easier for other like organizations to get access to your healthcare data.
But do I get like a PDF or something? Like
that's actually where FHIR is valuable because FHIR is built on a REST API framework.
So there's a lot of progress in that recently, and it's probably only going to get better.
That's
quickly.
cool.
So access is like, in general, we're in a much better place than we were like 5 years ago even. But that just means more of this raw data and then more data transformation to solve.
What does data transformation look like in this case?
It's a lot of kind of like organizing the data. It's a lot of building concepts, like defining. So, for example, like building an ontology. Ontology is just like a class of terminologies.
Yeah.
Like the lowest level might be an ICD-10 code, which ICD-10 codes define something like a disease like atherosclerosis, which are other diseases in the cardiovascular disease family. So you kind of build this like hierarchy of codes, and then you're right. Basically, like how our data transformation works is it's a bunch of like SQL transformations because this is all happening in a data warehouse.
Right.
And then we are joining to these ontologies, which are basically like classes of codes built on top of each other.
Interesting.
So it's largely
It's a lot of transformation, a lot of normalization too, because there could be, for example, labs the same lab comes in different units, and when you want to do analytics and compare apples to apples, you have to have the same lab always in the same units. A lot of codes that are different represent the same lab, so you have to be able to say all of these correspond to the same lab. So that kind of normalization. And then data quality is a huge part of the pre-processing. But data quality with analytics use cases in mind, where you can immediately get access to a bunch of different data sets and very quickly be able to know what kinds of questions you can answer and what kinds of questions you cannot answer and why not. Is it because you're missing data elements, or is it because some of the data elements that are key for those questions have some data quality issue? And what is that data quality issue? So right now, organizations who get access to multiple sources of healthcare data from both claims and medical records suddenly get access to a new source, and they have no way of knowing immediately what kind of things they can and cannot do with that new source.
Interesting. It sounds complicated. Are you guys using graphs at all?
like graph databases.
Yeah.
No. But that
Interesting.
that might be, as like a useful tool for some of these ontologies.
It could be. I have no idea, right? Yeah, I was just thinking of
But yeah,
Who knows?
all of our transformation pipelines are DAGs, so they're technically graphs of transformations, but they're relational tables.
Interesting. So what about like machine learning data science? I know you're into that, Coco, and I don't know about you, Aaron, but like that's used to be what you're good at. Are you still doing it at all, or are you kind of moved on?
Well, we're interested in open sourcing a bunch of healthcare-specific machine learning models. But the trick really, where all the work is in actually preparing the training sets for these data models, for these machine learning models.
You can see that.
And all the data transformation that is required to go from raw data to the training set.
Yeah. Like a lot of the most interesting use cases for machine learning in healthcare fall into this bucket called risk stratification, which is basically trying to predict when a patient is going to have some event. It could be anything, like an avoidable ED visit or some like a complication related to an underlying chronic disease, so that the care team could be like, hey, maybe this is a chance we could like intervene here and like avoid a bad outcome. All these kind of use cases fall under like the bucket of risk stratification. And training those these are just like supervised learning, tree-based machine learning models for the most part. We're not talking about like generative AI or anything like that. But if you don't have, essentially you need a data set with concepts. Like, what is a preventable ED visit? That is a complex concept. If that's a column in your data set and you trust how that's created, training these models is relatively straightforward.
But do you?
If it's not,
Yeah.
Well,
you're
that's
going to
where
spend 3 months defining that concept.
exactly.
basically.
That's where the bulk of the work is in defining these concepts. And this is where it gets really interesting with the future of this space with LLMs. If you start having models that you can ask questions to in natural language, and you can say how many preventable ED visits happened last year, and then the model goes and defines the concept of a preventable ED visit by itself and gives you an answer to your question. Then the tricky thing is like the way the concept is defined is not necessarily deterministic in an LLM. And so determinism is at the core of this. Because when you want to do benchmarking across the whole industry, how different organizations are performing in healthcare, you need to measure everybody with the same ruler, and you have to define the concept in the same way. But if everybody's doing analytics in a non-deterministic way, or an LLM is defining the concepts on the fly, they might be defined in a smart way, but it doesn't guarantee that it's defined the same way across organizations. And it's also not necessarily something that has been peer-reviewed and approved by clinical experts, that everybody agrees this is how we're going to define a patient with type 2 diabetes, this is how we're going to define a preventable ED visit.
Does that happen now?
That
what you just described, kind of the peer-reviewed.
That's a challenge with things being closed, and that's why we believe in the importance of open source. Many organizations define their proprietary analytics secret sauce behind their closed doors, and nobody else knows how they're defining that. And so we think the purpose of open source is for the whole industry to see the key concepts that we're all using. This is how they're defined in code. Everybody can benefit from these definitions and peer review them. And it's just a code base, that's maintained for the industry. So there's no sense of authority, like a team at some academic center defined this and nobody knows how they defined it and nobody can question it. This is just open for everybody to just review. So I think the future of analytics for the whole industry is for it to be completely open, so everybody can see code.
I guess what's in the way of that?
Well, like going back, like look at healthcare data analytics companies today. I think I really think it's like the business model. Like open source is a give to get business model, right? So we're trying there's open source projects in healthcare today, but they tend to be backed by like nonprofit consortiums, and usually the result is like when you think of like a really successful open source project, what do you think of?
DBT is a good one.
Right. And so there's like a significant R&D investment that DBT is putting into DBT.
And they have a community.
They have a community.
Yeah.
And they also have because of the backing of like the for-profit company, they have the ability to make large commercial investments in the open source.
Right.
And I think when you lack that, you get more of like not all the time, but often you can get like stuff that's not quite as baked. And so like that's obviously like there's exceptions to that for sure.
Right.
But I think a big part of it has been why you haven't seen commercial open source companies in healthcare is like it's hard. If you're going to be a commercial company, then it's like, what's your business model? Like, how are you going to make money? And I think the simplest thing for data companies to think about in healthcare is like, okay, this thing I'm doing is already complex enough. People will pay me for this. So why don't I just go and do that? Like before there was Health Catalyst back in 2009, Health Catalyst was like the first of its breed kind of for part of its early cohort. And so but now today there's lots of companies that are in the healthcare data space. And if you're going to go be another healthcare data company today and not take an innovative approach, then I think you're going to be one of like 100 or one of 1,000. Yeah,
which kind of sucks.
And so the way we kind of came at it is kind of like, one, we had this like altruistic view of like, well, we think this stuff should be open. Like when you read about new treatments in the newspaper all the time, nobody's keeping that stuff secret, right? And then at the same time, we were like, look, this would be a way, like on the commercial side, to do things differently. Now what we're trying to figure out right now is like, where do you draw the line between what's open and what's closed? And that's honestly,
what is that line for you guys?
Where we're drawing it is like all these like high level concepts, like data marts, like measures, groupers, like how do you define an episode of care for like a knee replacement? Care pathways, like what do standard of care treatment definitions and outcomes look like for multiple myeloma, or all different sorts of ontologies. That's all open. Everything there is open. The other thing that we're making completely open is our core data model.
Okay.
Which is like anybody who's doing healthcare analytics basically starts from like a core data model and then builds like other kind of things on top of that. And so these are things like when we were on healthcare data teams previously, like when I was at Health Catalyst or when Coco was at Strive, like our teams were reinventing the wheel on all these things all the time. And so we were like, these are the things that should be completely open. And so they're open, they're licensed under Apache 2, anybody can use them for any reason, it's totally fine.
It's cool.
The things that are closed for us are like the first mile from raw data all the way up to that core data model, right? So this is basically the processing that any team would have to do if they were going to use the open source themselves. And depending on how many data sources raw data sources they have, like if they had a medical record system, a claims data set, access to a FHIR API, merging all that data into the consolidated patient record, the common data model, that might take 3 or 4 engineers like full time to make sure that's really done right and the data quality is good. It sucks. So the core offering that we're trying to do is be like, hey, if you're an organization that has to do that, we'll take that off your shoulders with a turnkey solution, and then your team can just focus on the analysis. So
Interesting. I guess what's the distribution for this then? How do you get out there and make people aware that this exists? Because you said it's a really crowded market too. So
Yeah, I mean, we started our focus, like Aaron said, just building these concepts and these data marts and putting them out in the open. So people have joined our Slack community, people are trying to do analytics on all these topics that we've open sourced, and they're using our data marts. People have realized that in order to use the data marts, you have to start from some input, and that is our healthcare data model. But then getting your data into that data model is a lot of work. So the way it's been going so far is people just use the open source, and then they try to map all these raw data sources into the common data model to run the different marts, and just realizing how much work that is. That's where we start getting what we call Tuva Cloud customers, that people who want to use the product.
That's really cool.
I don't know that we've been very good at distribution, to be honest. We kind of been working in secret, and then we'll have like
After this podcast, though, don't worry about it.
this is our
Hanging on your
distribution.
door, so.
But we haven't been like very vocal about what we're doing. We're just focused on building and.
Yeah, interesting.
You know, it's like the Slack community, for example. Like usually, like every week, there's a couple people that join, and sometimes there'll be somebody that posts that they're like super excited about it. And the way I think of it is like when I first got into healthcare, I started working for Colorado Medicaid right out of grad school, and I didn't know anything about claims data, but I'd done a ton of data analysis, and so I was like, well, this is going to be easy. And then as I got into it, I realized that I couldn't answer any of these simple questions.
Right.
And so literally I just had to sit, like, I was just bothering people all the time. Like there were some really knowledgeable folks at there that I think are still there that I worked with, who I would just like ask questions to all the time. You can't Google any of this stuff.
Really?
Which revenue codes should be included in the definition of an ED visit? Nothing. You ask ChatGPT that, nothing, right? So in the absence of, like, that's the point of Slack for us, is kind of like, let's get all the healthcare data practitioners together, and then somebody's working with some source or somebody doesn't know how to define something, ask it here, and you'll have a bunch, somebody hopefully has dealt with the same problem as you.
Right. Well, that's interesting. Kind of switching gears a bit, though. I mean, so you guys came from having jobs and working in healthcare for a while to doing a startup on your own. I mean, walking through that journey, what are you? It seems like a bit of a pivot personally. So.
Yeah, it was a fun adventure. Aaron and I were just talking about it for a while, and we thought it'd be really cool. We were excited about the potential of doing something in this space, and one day we were just like, oh, let's just do it. Let's just quit our jobs this month. And
I think Lindsay was like, Coco's wife Lindsay was like, oh, you guys should do this.
Yeah.
And my wife Megan was kind of like, you're gonna need to put this in writing.
Okay. Oh, because I remember we had, like I said, when we started off, we had lunch a couple of years ago, and you guys had a consulting company at the time, and I think I was like, yeah, I don't know, man, maybe you want to try something different. I was running one at the time, and I was like, just avoid it if you can. But
so I mean, we knew we were going to do something in the healthcare data space, but we just didn't know. In my view in life is like, if you're not doing something different, if you don't have like unique you're kind of like howling into the wind, you know? So what was going to be different about what we were doing? There's lots of other healthcare data companies, right? And so it took us probably 6 months to figure out like the two things that we think were going to be different for us. And one was like, we're going to open source a good portion of this. And the other is we're going to have this like psychotic focus on pre-processing and data quality.
Interesting.
And that pre-processing data quality stuff is, like I mentioned earlier, it's like kind of an afterthought to the other companies. Everybody's selling the dashboard. Everybody's like, we have a machine learning model for that. But without the pre-processing, it's like garbage in, garbage out.
Interesting. Yeah, because I think I saw Coco at the Park Cafe here in Salt Lake City. I'm like, what are you up to? So how's your company going? I was like, oh, we're in YC right now. I was like, what?
Yeah.
Just blown away. The rest of the day I was thinking, God, I'm really, really stoked for you guys. I mean, it's not easy to get into YC.
No.
First of all, you know, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was neat. I mean, YC was super helpful on a number of levels. I would say we didn't realize how bad we were at fundraising until we got into YC.
Oh.
like we were kind of like, hey, we can probably raise some money. And then, had a few meetings and they didn't go anywhere. And then we got into YC and we were kind of like, oh, we know nothing about this. So kind of went from nothing to sort of having a bachelor's degree and, fundraising sort of.
They do a good job at, I think, putting you through the ringer there.
Totally.
A lot of friends that went through YC. It's boot camp.
Yeah.
So that's cool. What were some of your biggest takeaways from that, apart from fundraising? And did you learn anything else?
I mean, it was cool. There were tons of cool speakers that we got to hear and listen to. I'm trying to think of like specific things.
Well, I mean, it's also just good advice on how to think about a startup. There's just so many things that, a lot of that is common sense, but you don't really think about it until somebody's like explicitly telling you, these guiding rules of thumb that you should be operating by every day. So it's basically like completely opposite advice to how to run a big company, and you're just doing things that don't scale, and you're constantly just worried about talking to your customers and
getting users, building community. Yeah, it's an interesting problem I see with a lot of startups. Like, they focus on building a great product, which is what they should do, but then distribution is like the one thing where I think that a lot of startups I've seen, and some YC friends as well, where there's like, holy crap, we have a great product, but like nobody knows who we are, and it just
I mean, that's very relevant for us because we're both product founders and we're both technical founders that are so focused on building a good product, but we don't know anything or even are interested in sales and marketing. And we're like, oh, at some point I guess we gotta tell the world about what we're doing, but we're just so focused on the product right now, and that's how it's been.
I mean, that's how it probably should be at this stage, though. If it's awesome, then I think a lot of things take care of itself. But because if it sucks, you tell everybody about it. I don't know. It doesn't really help you either.
Yeah.
So, especially in this space where it's like there's so many convolutions you can go through as well with the types of data sets and the problems you're solving, where I think that at least you can get something that's awesome. Again, I know nothing about the space, but it seems like from what I've heard, that's part of it is just capturing. But the data model is a really interesting one. Like, walk me through the insight where you realize from the time we were talking about consulting to coming with a data model, that seems like a very interesting insight.
Well, I mean, I think every healthcare data team has like a common data model that we're working on.
Okay.
Like, even before we left, this was something we like built and had at all of our previous companies. It's just a question of like, what's the right design of a healthcare data model to power all your analytics use cases.
Yeah, and also, I mean, there are several pretty popular healthcare data models out there that many organizations use. Still, even with those data models that people have put a lot of thought into designing, I would say most organizations are just designing their own data model from scratch and reinventing the wheel. At least every organization I've worked at.
Why do you think that is?
I think part of the reason is that there is no such thing as the perfect healthcare data model, or probably for anything. It's just like kind of a matter of what you're trying to do with the data. For example, FHIR is like a really good data model for interoperability, for moving data around.
Right.
There's other data models like Odyssey's OMOP, which is very well designed for doing kind of more academic type studies. And so, like, depending on what you're trying to do, are you going to work with, if you're working only with claims data exclusively, you're probably going to use a leaner data model that's focused on claims data and not on data elements that are only available in electronic health records. And so, depending on your data sources, depending on your use cases, your data model might change. So there's a lot of variability.
I also think there's this here's what I think is the big thing. Is not starting with the end in mind. This is like a fundamental belief that Coco and I have and talk about at least weekly, which is like most people that are working with data, not even just in healthcare, but just in general, don't start with the end in mind. The end is like, what question am I going to answer, and who's that question important to? Then backing up from there to like, here's how the data table, like what are the columns, what do the rows represent in the table, need to be designed to answer that question. Then backing up from the data table to the transformation that you need to do from the raw data to get there. Most people don't think like that. A lot of the data model, if I think back through my career around like data modeling conversations, like data warehouse data modeling conversations, it's more along the lines of like, we need a spot to put this data element. Where are we going to put this data element? Which is starting from the other way.
Yeah, it's true.
So this was like a long journey this is part of our long journey of discovery that we've been on over the last 15 months. We had to like build all these different data marts that can do all these different types of analytics to figure out what the data model actually should be.
That's a lot of work.
So it's just been in the last probably like 2 months that our view of what the data model that we can call the consolidated patient record has really come into focus.
Really?
We're like, this is like a pretty kick-ass data model for healthcare data.
This is like where our strong interest in data quality also comes really into play, because we're so interested in very deep fit for purpose data quality, which is very different than what a lot of organizations are doing with data quality. Is they map all their data to a data model and they write a bunch of data quality tests on this raw data. But the data quality is like, is this field populated? Does the distribution of values in this field look reasonable? But it's nothing related to, can I answer these particular analytics questions? And if I answer those questions, do the answers look reasonable? And do I have the data elements to answer those questions? And if I do have them, are there data problems that lead to something being wrong with the answer to those questions? And so we're very focused on data quality, but starting with the end in mind, with these analytics and use cases, working backwards from there, and then writing data quality at the raw data that's motivated by the end use cases.
Jeez.
But that informs obviously how the data model needs to look to write these data quality tests for the end use cases.
Man. You got my head spinning here. So that's really interesting. I guess so if you kind of zoom out in a couple of years, like what do you think the data model is? Do you think you have something that's generic enough to you can use like worldwide on any use case, or are there always going to be like certain nuances?
So I think fundamentally what we're trying to do is model human biology in the delivery of medicine.
Okay.
Like that's what's happening.
Easy enough.
And the reason I say that is because when you start from that premise, then you're like, okay, well those things should be generally the same around the globe.
Yeah.
Right? We're all humans. There's obviously variation in the practice of medicine, but like generally, the industry conforms over time to standards. So like if you start from that premise, it's like, okay, we should be able to like model data in a way that kind of works for every country, every different group of people. Now the challenge is not like different countries have different coding systems.
Right.
And so it's like the challenge that we're solving kind of in the US is like going to have to be solved again and again and again to some degree with different coding systems in different languages around the world. So I would feel really great if we could solve this for the US and every company in the US could stop reinventing, the wheel on this problem over and over again. If we could do it for the whole world, that would be great. I think somebody needs to do it for these other countries. If like this is just the direction it needs to go, if not us, then somebody.
Dang, it's so gnarly.
It's crazy.
One principle that's come into focus for us in the last few months is this idea of modularity in the data model, where we basically are so focused on end use cases like Aaron was talking about, and we're so focused on the data elements that are needed for different use cases.
Yeah.
And so you can think of it as all these mini data models. There's a lean, we call them lean input layers. So let's say if you want to do readmission analytics, you need like these 14 data elements, and they need to look like this. If you want to do like spend and utilization analytics, you need these handful of data elements for that. And so we have all these lean inputs, and then we work backwards from there, and then we say what data model needs to exist to be able to populate all these lean inputs. And then you can, maybe with the data sources that you have access to, you can only populate a fraction of the data model. But from there you can see which of the lean inputs you can populate downstream, and therefore you can see which analytics use cases you can answer or you can do, and what problems there would be with your data for those use cases. So the data model itself could be evolving over time as long as it can always populate all these little lean inputs, which you can think of like mini data models.
That's interesting. Have you had the notion of like a semantic layer for medical data?
I mean, I think that's kind of what I've heard that term before.
It sounds familiar. Yeah.
I don't really. I think maybe that's kind of what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean,
here.
depends what you mean by that.
It's
But when I think of
like
semantic layer, I just imagine a universe of high level concepts. That's what.
Yeah,
it is in my
it's a
mind.
reusability of concepts. To find it
Yeah.
once and reuse it elsewhere, right? So, but it sounds like that's kind of what you're.
But that's exactly so we're
So like
we're
think about
talking
this. So like atomic level data. What is an ED visit? Well, it depends on the medical record. It depends on the source of information. If you're building ED visits from claims, the ingredients for that are data elements like bill type code, place of service code, revenue code, the relevant claim dates, right? Then you kind of use those raw data elements to construct this ED visit. Okay, well, what about flagging ED visits as being preventable or not? You're using other atomic level things like diagnosis codes to basically say, is this an ED visit that could have been treated in a less acute way, like in an office visit or a walk-in or something like that. So you're kind of building this lattice of concepts that then build on top of each other, and ultimately, you use in some sort of a dashboard or ad hoc analysis or to train a model of some kind. So if that's what a semantic layer is, then yeah,
Exactly.
That's 100%.
Similar-ish, yeah.
And that's where it's interesting how little differences in how you define these concepts on the semantic layer could give rise to different answers. We just recently posted a video of an analysis where we calculate spend and utilization with two different methods that we know are used by different organizations. You can see between 10 and 20% difference in the reported spend with the same data. Just
same data, different results.
same data. And so that's really interesting to us because you can easily say like, hey, our goal is to reduce spend and utilization spend for these kinds of visits by 20% this year, and you could just calculate it in a slightly different way and you're done, right? So
That's interesting.
Same data, different results.
I don't have to get that paper. What's that paper called again?
I think it's called Same Data, Different Conclusions.
Okay. I think this is it's worth checking out, so I'll put that in the show notes for the audience there.
Yeah.
I guess kind of wrapping up a bit. I know you got to get to a call in a bit there, Aaron. Anything else that you guys want to riff on, or anything on your mind in respect to the healthcare, or anything else?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's of interest to me is just what does the future of this world look like? Because we've talked about it. Obviously, like if there's general AI one day, like, we're all irrelevant at that point. But at what point does AI get good enough that any work that we're focused on is irrelevant? And this is where, we all had a conversation at some point in the past about what Stephen Wolfram was doing with ChatGPT, and it's really interesting how Wolfram Alpha could be kind of an engine that an LLM can call in the back end to answer specific questions. So could the same thing happen in healthcare? That's something we're interested in. And basically our view is that there's going to be concepts, there's always this universe of concepts that have to be defined beforehand in a way that's peer reviewed and clinicians have agreed upon them. And then some kind of system that you interact with through natural language or something like that can call on these concepts to give you answers to questions. And it's probably analogous. I'd love to hear examples of how Wolfram have they designed this interaction between ChatGPT and Wolfram Alpha. But basically the idea is that you can ChatGPT, for example, you're trying to solve a system of linear equations or solve a partial differential equation. Then ChatGPT can call on Wolfram Alpha to always solve it with the exact same method that gives the same answer.
Yeah.
But if you can, like for example, my wife Lindsay and I played this game the other day where we were trying to come up with the simplest math questions that ChatGPT would get wrong, and we were just trying to see.
And what was it?
We came up with a bunch of examples, but one example was, let's toss a die until you get at least ones of every number. So you have at least 1 1, at least 1 2, at least 1 3, at least 1 6. What is the probability that will happen in exactly 7 tosses of the die? And ChatGPT would get that wrong. And then, these are simple questions that a high school student should be able to answer. And then the other game we were playing is, can we come up with really simple questions that ChatGPT would give completely different answers to when we ask it the question a couple different times, or when we word the same question, we word it slightly differently, but a human would know it's the same question.
Yeah.
But it'd give a different answer. So we're just playing this game, and it's so interesting. But it's, in my mind, it's completely analogous to, like, can you define this slightly differently in healthcare and then get completely different answers? But just like. Basically, TLDR is, I feel like even if AI gets to the point where you can interact with it and it can give you really smart ways of doing analytics and come up with ways of doing analytics for your questions of interest on the fly, for healthcare analytics and benchmarking, you can't just have things on the fly. You have to agree upon as an industry how you define each concept beforehand and always use the same concept defined in the same way. Otherwise, you can have this variability that's obviously completely deal breaker for benchmarking.
Man, it's dangerous sometimes
too.
Yeah. Very cool. I guess for people who want to learn more about what you guys are doing, how can they do that?
They can go to the tuvaproject.com. That's our open source. Or go to tuvahealth.com.
Nice.
Or check us out on LinkedIn.
Yeah. Awesome. We're good to hang out?
Yeah.
Thanks for
having us, Joe.
Yeah, anytime.